pleased to introduce our next speaker, John Marion. He's the Executive Director of Common Cause, Rhode Island. Taking on tough issues like campaign finance disclosure, the Ethics Commission's jurisdiction over the General Assembly, voter access, and open records. John is the voice of good government in our state. Please, everyone, welcome John Marion.
Thank you. We all had that charismatic teacher growing up. Then we had teachers like me. So I apologize in advance. That is hard to follow.
We love you, John.
Yeah, I actually taught as an adjunct for many years. My favorite, in college you do those one-page evaluations of your professors, and nobody wanted to do it, so you just scribbled it down and just handed it in real quick. And all it said was, "Your voice is a monotone." That will never leave me. But no, thanks for having me. As you heard, I'm from Common Cause, Rhode Island. We're a good government group, although we sort of stylize ourselves more as a pro-democracy group these days. And I was invited to talk about 3 subjects, so I'm going to try to, this is going to be a bit of a mashup. The first one is something, how many people were here at this event last year? So a good chunk of you. This is going to be a little bit of a repeat, but I'll try to get through it a little quicker. Sort of a little bit about our history and how it has resulted in a very powerful legislature, and one that has a significant concentration of power. And I think you're going to hear from, I'm sandwiched between 2 amazing speakers. This is horrible. We own a little bit about the results of that in a second. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about same-day voter registration. I can answer the person's question about how many people vote by filling in a paper ballot. And then I'm going to finish talking a little bit about, there's a constitutional convention question on the ballot. It's question 1. A little bit about that. I'm going to stick around for the rest of the day. I will not get through all of your questions, I suspect. I'll be at that table in the corner, so during the break or afterward, if I don't get to your question, please come find me, because I'm happy to try to answer your question. I nerd out on the questions about paper ballots. So the first thing is about what I talked about last year, which is legislative power in the state and the concentration of power within the legislature. Those are 2 different things. And we, as a state, are almost unique in that we have arguably the most powerful legislature vis-a-vis the other 2 branches of government in the country. And then we also happen to have, and there are other states with powerful legislatures, but we also happen to have one where power within the legislature is concentrated in the leadership more than it is in almost every other state. And so that's a result of our history. So again, following the history teacher, I'm going to try to give you a little dose of history. The Secretary of State's office actually maintains an amazing museum in the State House. It's like 1 room, but it's for the Royal Charter of 1663. Has anybody ever been in that museum? If you haven't, you need to go in. It's 20 minutes of your time, but it is so worth it. When you go in the front doors, go up that first set of steps, go to your left, and it's down the hall on your right. It's open whenever the building's open, roughly. In there, preserved, is the charter that the king gave the state of Rhode Island in 1663, known primarily as the document that provided religious liberty or freedom of conscience to Rhode Islanders, but had this other thing, which was it basically gave us a parliamentary system of government, right? And when Rhode Island declared independence and joined the other states reluctantly in the new constitution, we were one of 2 states that actually didn't create a new constitution. So John Adams, he wrote a beautiful Massachusetts constitution that's largely still in place. We did not. We stuck with the Charter of 1663. And so we had essentially a parliamentary system of government until the 1840s. And in the 1840s, something happened, which was out in the woods in Chepachet. among other places in the state. A guy named Thomas Dorr fought an armed rebellion. He was very unsuccessful in the armed part against the state government. And it forced the incumbent government of Governor King to finally call a convention and create a state constitution. And it started to bring a little balance between the three branches of government, but not completely. Still in the 19th century, our legislature sat as our Supreme Court. Still, it exercised most executive powers you would think of a governor exercising today. Fast forward, my organization kind of came to this issue in the 1990s. It was a very weird thing, talk about bipartisan. It was Sheldon Whitehouse, then just an attorney for a governor, and Bob Flanders, who was as Republican as you get, former member of the state Supreme Court, kind of came together and worked on putting separation of powers in our state constitution. And we achieved that in 2004, where we put 3 changes into our state constitution, among them adding a language about 3 separate and distinct branches of government. But still, even then, we have one of the strongest legislatures and one of the weaker executives, if you measure it, because that historical legacy. So that's sort of the 3 branches of government. Within that branch, power is very centralized in the leadership of the legislature. So in this, was it in the spring, A.G. Nerona spoke here, and he said it's a dictatorship. That's a little extreme, but he said it right now it's a benevolent dictatorship where the Speaker of the House and the Senate President sort of preside over their respective chambers and control the flow of legislation almost unilaterally. You're going to hear later from Kate and others about what that has meant for some of the bills. You'll hear from Fiona about the fate of payday lending reform. That is also, a reflection of our history. So when we did write a constitution, we put very few restrictions on the legislature and very few restrictions on the leadership of the legislature. What do I mean by that? So our legislature goes home for the year when the Speaker decides we're done. It's very hard when you work up there like I do, or when even rank and file legislators like Secretary Amore, when he was in the House, you try to explain to your family, we can't take vacation in June because they may or may not finish somewhere in June. That is unlike most state legislatures where they have a date where they're done, and at 12:01 a.m. The next morning, they're done for the year and they can't keep legislating. Here, there are no restrictions, and so because our Constitution doesn't contain those restrictions, it basically gives power to the leadership. And they do it through the Constitution, but also the biggest device is through the rules of the House and the Senate. And so essentially the rank and file delegate to the leadership through the rules that have to be passed every year, the power to control the agenda, control committee assignments, and a whole bunch of levers that the leadership can use to kind of control how the building works. One of the levers nobody really talks about is like the whole staff is at-will employees, from the guy pushing the broom to the most senior lawyer in the building are all at-will employees. That is unusual. Most states have a professionalized policy staff, a professionalized legal staff. Here, many of them are great professionals, but they're political appointees, and therefore, that is a form of power that the leadership can exercise. So there are also soft forms of power. Our campaign finance system creates a soft form of power, right? So we allow in this country, private funding of campaigns, and as a result, those who want something out of the legislature, what economists call rent-seeking groups, they have to donate to get what they want. And as a result, money flows to power. And as you see, when I did it last year, I had a nice graph. Political scientists were trying to kind of measure how powerful legislative leaders were, so they took the ratio of the campaign account of the Speaker of the House to the average rep in all 50 states, and they found we had the biggest ratio because money flows to who controls the agenda and who controls the fate of the legislation that the people making the donations come from. So there's sort of hard power in our Constitution, in those rules, and then there's soft power exercised through our campaign finance system. So that's sort of not the most optimistic part of my talk, but that's sort of setting the table for some of the discussion to come about why it might be so difficult to get some of the public interest legislation that we're talking about through the legislature. However, it's not all bad, right? So the next part I want to talk about is a little bit about voting rights. Rhode Island has a long and very storied history of expanding voting rights. It has come in fits and starts. There have definitely been some jumps forward in progress, and there have been some steps back over the years. Again, one of the big jumps came in the 1840s with Thomas Dorr. Dorr ran on expanding access to the ballot, particularly for new immigrant communities in the state. And I could go, I don't have enough time, but I could go through the many sort of jumps that have been made in the 19th and 20th century. In some ways, Rhode Island has been a leader. So in 2006, Rhode Island was the first state ever to put on the ballot restoring voting rights to all felons immediately upon release from prison. It passed 51 to 49%, passed by the skin of its teeth, but we did it. And I actually talked to the person who ran the campaign in Florida to do the same, which was successful, although has since been undermined by the legislature. And she said, we studied Rhode Island's campaign plan. Like, we took our inspiration from what Rhode Island did. So we've had some real successes. That said, about 15 years ago, it sort of came, my organization had worked a lot on separation of powers, and that we were kind of looking to pivot, and it really became apparent that the machinery of democracy, quite physically in the state, was not working. I'll take it back to the 2012 election. There were some real problems with how that election ran. Rhode Island was one of the last states to expand access to early voting and voting by mail. So the result was 95% of Rhode Islanders were voting at a polling place on election day, as recently as 3 presidential elections ago. And if a machine broke in a polling place, people were out of luck. A line would form. Our machines at that point were so old they couldn't find spare parts. And a line would form and people would get frustrated and they'd walk out and they wouldn't vote. So my organization and allies, including the newly elected Secretary of State in 2014, Nellie Gorbea, decided there's a lot that needs to be done to modernize how our elections are run and to expand voting rights. So very quickly, we did a bunch of things. So in 2016, we passed online voter registration. In 2016, the state got new voting machines, replacing those jalopies that were breaking down. In 2017, we got something called automatic voter registration, which is when you go to the DMV, you don't sign up to vote, you sign up to not register. So you have to opt out, and that little change actually drastically increases participation. 2017, you heard, we passed the risk limiting audits. But still, like, most of those were back end sort of mechanical administration things. We weren't expanding access to the ballot itself. We were expanding access to registration, but not really the ballot. We met fierce resistance in the legislature to early voting, but the pandemic forced the legislature to address that. In 2020, they created, in all but name, an early voting system, and it has been wildly successful and wildly popular, including among people who are election deniers. In fact, if you look at the partisan skew, the folks who are voting early tend to be the folks who have been trained not to trust mail ballots, even though voting early is essentially very similar to casting a mail ballot in Rhode Island law. And then in 2022, we passed something called the Let I Vote Act, which made permanent a bunch of pandemic era changes that allow people to vote easier by mail. So now Rhode Island is far more reflective of the average state, where a voter can vote in person on election day, which seems to be the preferential mode for most people, you know, good for them. Or you can vote by mail, or you can vote early. However, all of those changes haven't drastically, they've increased access, but they haven't necessarily drastically increased turnout. The thing that will increase turnout is changing our voter registration deadline. So we are here on October 6th. It is voter registration deadline day in the state of Rhode Island. So first of all, it's a Sunday. Most people aren't thinking about voter registration on a Sunday. Boards of canvassers throughout the state are open. Nobody is showing up at their offices because nobody is thinking, boy, my board of canvassers is probably open in my town hall. But this is all because Rhode Island has a 30-day voter registration deadline, the longest in the nation. There are a few other states with the 30-day deadline, but we are the longest in the nation. Longest by 20 days of any state in New England. And our problem is that it's baked into our state constitution. So back in 1974, they rewrote the suffrage amendment part of our state constitution, and they put in the registration deadline. We're one of only 3 states with it in the Constitution: New York, Ohio, Rhode Island. So that means it's the hardest in the nation to amend. So we're going to have to amend the state constitution, which means we're going to have to convince the legislature to put it on the ballot. And there are skeptics in the legislature, particularly in legislative leadership, who don't want to change how elections are run because that's how they got elected under the current regime. And so we're going to have to build power to do this. And so I'm going to point you, I will be in that table. I forgot to bring the sign-up sheets, but if you want to join the effort, I'll literally just write your name down. You can join the effort to do this. So the last thing I'm supposed to talk about is question 1, and I understand, like, I'm jumping around here. So there is going to be a question on the ballot on November 5th. And it is going to read, shall there be a convention to amend or revise the Rhode Island Constitution? So I'm going to I'll just pass these around. I did 60 copies. Thanks. Back in 1974, when they were in the process of also cementing in our registration deadline in the state constitution, they had this idea to put in the state constitution a question that has to be on the ballot every 10 years. It can go on the ballot more frequently, but it has to be on the ballot every 10 years. And it is a question of, should there be a constitutional convention in the state of Rhode Island? And if a majority of voters, simple majority of voters, say yes, then it triggers a process for calling a convention in the state. Rhode Island voters in 1984 were like, yeah, that sounds good. And we had a convention in 1986. What he's handing out is actually a fact sheet about that 86 convention. Just sort of like how many people were elected, how many people voted, what the questions they put on the ballot were. A constitutional convention is just what it sounds like. It's a convention of delegates who gather to suggest changes to the state constitution. In Rhode Island, the number of delegates is pegged to the number of members of the House of Representatives. So in 1986, that was 100 delegates. This time it would be 75 delegates because we've downsized the legislature. They would gather, they would introduce and debate proposals, and then they have the power to put on the ballot suggested changes to the state constitution. There have been 11 of these in our state's history. Thanks, 10 minutes. The first ones were, I believe, in the 1820s, but there have been some very significant ones. The one in 1842 that resulted in the sort of basis of our current Constitution. In the 1950s, there were actually 3 of them. There was one in the 60s that went on for 4 years. Then there was the one in 1973, not 1974, that created this mechanism for putting the question on the ballot every 10 years. So it was on the ballot in 84 and passed. It was on the ballot in 94, 2004, 2014, and defeated every time. When we had a convention in Rhode Island in 1986, we were the last state in the union to do this. There hasn't been a full convention in any state since, even though there have been dozens and dozens and dozens over the history of the Republic, looking across all 50 states. They were really common, particularly in the middle part of the 20th century in the United States. There's speculation for why they haven't been happening anymore, but I think it's just speculation. There hasn't been really any good research showing why they haven't been happening more recently. But the way it worked most recently was it passed in 84, then in 1985, the General Assembly passed what's called an enabling statute, basically just a law saying how the convention would work. And so it said that there would be a nonpartisan election of delegates in the fall of 1985, and then the convention would meet starting in January of 1986. You can see on that handout that election happened. About 96,000 people voted in it, so super small turnout, relatively speaking. But a lot of people ran, and it was a winner-take-all plurality election. So the average person who won with about 20% of the vote. So just some things to think about. And then they met for the first 6 months of 1986, kind of in parallel with the legislature. And they proposed 14 changes to the state constitution, and they're listed on there. 8 of them passed, 6 of them went down to defeat, and it lists the topics. The one you probably heard the most about was it was called the Paramount Right to Life Amendment, which went down to defeat 2-1. So that was sort of the high-profile one. That was the one that got the most votes in 1986. It also, there was one that created the State Ethics Commission, among others. So it was a mix of structural reforms, but also it put some social issues on the ballot. The reason I'm speaking in very neutral language here, my organization doesn't take a position on this. My board is split on whether there should be a convention or not. So we're just sort of engaging in public education. There is a robust group of organizations, many of which we're allied with in other work, that is rooting against this and actually spending on a campaign against this, including the ACLU, among others. They're arguing that the convention is unaccountable, right? You get elected delegate, you never sit for re-election again. That the convention can put basic rights up for popular vote, which they did in 1986 with the Right to Life Amendment. They also argue that outside money is far bigger than it was in 1986. They're absolutely right. I actually went through the campaign finance reports from 1986, and it's rather quaint to see the tiny amounts of money that candidates used to run for office in 1986. And they argue that, you know, we live in a very different time, right? The Supreme Court of the United States has kind of lowered the floor of what our rights are. And so the federal constitution is the floor. Our state constitution can add rights, but it can't go lower than the federal constitution. Well, if the federal constitutional floor is being lowered, then you know, the state constitutional convention could do bad things. The pro, and there is no organized pro coalition, points to the fact that it's a mechanism for bypassing the legislature, right? So, you know, things that we want to reform, including common cause, that require a constitutional amendment, especially things that would take power away from the legislature, you know, that's hard to get the legislature to do that, although not impossible, as we've proved with separation of powers. And so the Constitutional Convention creates a way to bypass the legislature, which is an attractive argument if you're interested in some of these structural reforms, like redistricting reform that Common Cause talks about. So I'm going to stop there. I went 5 minutes longer than I hoped to. But I'm going to make 2 pitches before I go to questions. One is, yeah, come talk to me if you want to get involved with us on same-day voter registration. And then we actually have another volunteer opportunity, which is we put volunteers out on November 5th. We asked them to work 3-hour shifts, and they go and they make sure everything's going according to plan at polling places around the state. And if not, we elevate it to election officials to get things fixed. And they also engage with voters to inform them of their right to vote. If you're interested in volunteering, you know, come talk to me and we can get you signed up for that volunteer opportunity. If you have the ability to be a poll worker, it's our preference that you actually be a poll worker. There's a need for poll workers in the state of Rhode Island, a pretty desperate need. But if you can't commit to the 14 or 15 hours of being a poll worker and you want to do something a little less than that, you can come volunteer for us. So with that, I will stop, and there's going to be questions. I don't know, do we want to do the mic, or, yep, we'll start in the back and work our way forward.
I like the argument that the Constitutional Convention might bypass the legislature, but I'm questioning that statement if the suggestions or the determinations of the convention eventually get voted on by the legislature. How are you bypassing that?
Oh, sorry, I wasn't clear enough. So the legislature doesn't vote on the questions, the people do. So what would happen with the convention has the right to put questions on the ballot for the people at the next general election. So if it works as it did in the 80s, what would happen is the convention, a year from now, there would be an election of delegates. The convention would meet in the first half of 2026, and then November of 2026, there would be a question or questions on the ballot from the convention, and then the people would have a chance to decide. Yep.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Secretary Mori also. I'm new to Rhode Island, just moved back here east from Minnesota, where we do a lot of things right, thanks to Steve Simon. I'm very moved to be here because I'm aware of the history that down the street, or road, a couple of men got together and invented the idea of the inherent right of self-government in Rhode Island, right down the street, in the 17th century, and introduced to the world the basic framework of all parliamentary procedure. We've got rules, we've got constitutions, but the framework that Roger Williams and a bunch of men sat down with are basic. One, any person, any free man at that time can bring forward a law. All laws will be heard by the representative government, at the time the town's townsmen. All laws will be heard and publicly debated, and all those proposed laws will be eligible for a vote by the group that's appointed to represent us. What? Oh, now you're going to turn the mic on.
Oh. Yeah, it was on.
So those 4 basic steps were invented in Rhode Island and exported to the rest of the world. That is a true fact. I was surprised to learn it. Now back to Rhode Island, I started studying how we get things done here, or don't. And speaking of soft rules, which you're right about campaign finance, but I don't see anything written down in the law, in the rules of your Senate and House, in the written rules, that take away the parliamentary right of a representative to call a motion. That means we heard the rule, the law is brought to the legislature, any of us can do that. The legislators put it on the calendar, they're great at that. They assign it to appropriate committee, they're great at that. They have open public debate, many of us debated on issues, 4 very important issues that we talked about later today, all of which have been blocked because of a soft rule, I understand, that the leaders of your legislature can stop a committee chair or any committee member from bringing a motion to vote. Yes. Now Roger Williams said, all laws that are brought forward and publicly debated will be voted on, and we can vote them down. We can say, no, that's a really badass idea, we're not going to pass that. But we do not. So there is nothing written that I've read in the rules, which are there. And I would like to propose that in addition to organizing at other levels, we might call attention on your website, Secretary, and in our public, bring the public's attention to the rules and make it clear that there is no rule that entitles the President of the House and the Senate to put gag order, basically, on their committee chairs. All laws brought forward by the people should be publicly debated and decided on by their representatives in due process. And I would like an explanation for why we're not organizing to call attention. The legislators are scared to talk. The legislators are scared because the ones that don't have power, they're going to get, those are their bosses, basically. We're their bosses. But you understand the point. So I hope we will today focus on that particular rule and how we can make it public. Either introducing a rule that makes it illegal to censure a vote, a call to motion, or some other creative mechanism to restore to the right of the people the right for public debate and decision by our duly elected legislators. And I don't think that's a question.
Yep. And I know we're up on time. I just really briefly want to say, I think Kate's going to talk a little bit more about efforts to do something about that. I think you're right. There are norms, right? And it's a norm, for better or for worse. I would say for worse, that you can't introduce, essentially make a motion to have a vote on a bill without permission from legislative leadership. I am a victim of this. My organization for years pushed a constitutional amendment around ethics, and in 2012, I think, a legislator actually made the motion, and it passed, and the next night they came back, the they being the legislative leadership, and they nullified the vote, which is not a thing that you're allowed to do, but they did it. So yeah, we've been a victim of the norm. That is something that does need to change. I'm grateful to Kate for leading the charge to change it, and we'll be supportive. Our priority at the moment is same-day voter registration. We have limited resources, and we can take on only certain sacred cows at one time. We're going to take on that sacred cow at the moment, but we're supportive of efforts to small d democratize the legislature.
Thank you.
So, and I apologize. I'll be here the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.